Brigitte Bardot is no longer with us, but the story people think they know is only a small part of what she actually became. Most headlines remember her as a cinematic icon, a face that defined an era, and a symbol that changed how the world saw French film. But what happened after she stepped away from fame is far more unexpected and far more influential than her time on screen. Because while millions watched her rise, very few followed the moment she chose to disappear and quietly dedicate her life to something completely different. And understanding that choice changes how her entire legacy looks today. The news was confirmed by the Brigitte Bardot Foundation, which announced with deep sadness that its founder and president had passed away at the age of 91. According to publicly available information, Brigitte Bardot passed away peacefully at her home in southern France. No cause of death was disclosed, and no public funeral arrangements were announced at the time. The foundation emphasized respect, privacy, and continuity, stating clearly that her work would continue beyond her lifetime. But to understand why that message matters, we need to rewind. Because Brigitte Bardot wasn't just famous, she was transformational. In the mid-1950s, cinema was still bound by unspoken rules. Female characters were controlled, restrained, and carefully shaped to fit social expectations of the time. Then, in 1956, Bardot appeared in And God Created Woman. According to film historians, the movie didn't just introduce a new actress, it introduced a new cultural energy. Her performance challenged conventions, not through shock, but through presence, movement, confidence, a kind of freedom that felt unfamiliar to audiences at the time. Almost overnight, Bardot became an international sensation. But here's the part often overlooked. Behind the global attention, the pressure was immense. Fame arrived faster than the structures to support it. Interviews, photos, constant scrutiny, all intensified by the fact that Bardot became a symbol rather than simply a performer. A label followed her everywhere, often louder than her own voice. And that tension between public image and personal reality would quietly shape every decision she made next. As her career expanded, so did her discomfort with the machinery of celebrity. Despite starring in nearly 30 films, Bardot reportedly felt increasingly disconnected from the industry itself. According to interviews given later in life, she struggled with the expectations placed on her and the lack of personal control that came with worldwide fame. So in 1973, at the height of recognition many actors dream of reaching, she made a decision few understood at the time. She walked away. No farewell tour, no gradual retreat, no carefully staged transition. She simply stopped. And for years, the world assumed that was the end of the story. But in reality, it was the beginning of something far quieter and far more enduring. Because when Brigitte Bardot disappeared from cinema, she didn't disappear from purpose. She redirected it. Throughout the 1980s, Bardot re-emerged in a completely different role. Not as an actress, not as a celebrity, but as an advocate. She sold personal memorabilia, items tied directly to her fame, and used the proceeds to establish what would become the Brigitte Bardot Foundation. Its mission was clear: animal welfare, protection, and long-term systemic change. According to the Foundation's statements, this wasn't a side project, it became her life's work. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because unlike her film career, this chapter wasn't about attention, it was about persistence. While the public focus faded, her influence within animal welfare circles grew steadily. Legislative efforts, awareness campaigns, international partnerships all carry her name but not her image. And yet, many people never connected these two lives together, the global icon and the behind-the-scenes activist. But they were the same person. French President Emmanuel Macron acknowledged this dual legacy in a public tribute, describing Bardot as someone who embodied freedom, not just in art, but in conviction. And that word matters, freedom. Because Brigitte Bardot didn't just redefine femininity on screen, she redefined what it meant to step away from power, attention, and applause without disappearing from impact. And that raises an important question. If her most meaningful work happened outside the spotlight, why do we still focus so heavily on the beginning of her story? That answer reveals something deeper, not just about Bardot, but about how society measures legacy. As Brigitte Bardot stepped further away from public life, the narrative around her began to fracture. For some, she remained frozen in time, a symbol of 1950s cinema, youthful rebellion, and visual iconography that shaped fashion, film, and pop culture. For others, especially in France, she became something far more complex, because Bardot never attempted to reinvent herself for public approval. According to publicly available interviews and reporting, she avoided nostalgia tours, refused to soften her past for modern tastes, and showed little interest in maintaining celebrity relevance. This refusal, while consistent with her personality, often created distance between her and newer generations. But distance doesn't equal absence. Behind the scenes, the Brigitte Bardot Foundation expanded its reach. It funded shelters, supported international animal welfare initiatives, and lobbied for policy changes across multiple countries. These efforts rarely generated viral headlines, but they generated measurable outcomes. And that contrast is important, because in an age where visibility often defines value, Bardot chose effectiveness over applause. Yet that choice also came with misunderstandings. Over the years, Bardot's public statements, particularly made through open letters or interviews, were sometimes met with criticism or controversy. Media coverage often focused on isolated quotes rather than broader context, and her reluctance to engage with public clarification allowed narratives to harden without response. According to analysts and biographers, this silence was intentional. She didn't aim to manage perception. She aimed to remain consistent with herself. And that consistency is what makes her legacy difficult to summarize. Brigitte Bardot was never designed to fit cleanly into a single category. She was not just a performer, not just an activist, not just a cultural symbol. She was someone who resisted being simplified. This resistance is why her passing prompted such varied reactions. Tributes highlighted her cinematic impact, her influence on beauty standards, her activism, and her independence, all almost at once. French President Emmanuel Macron's remarks reflected this layered reality, referencing not only her films and public image, but also her inner struggles and lasting convictions. That balance matters, because it reframes her story away from spectacle toward continuity. From the outside, her life appears divided into two halves, fame and withdrawal. But in reality, both chapters were driven by the same core trait, autonomy. She chose her rise, she chose her exit, and she chose where her energy would go afterward. That level of agency is rare, especially in an industry built on consumption and repetition. And it leads to a bigger question. If someone's most influential work happens outside the spotlight, how do we measure their impact? Film historians will continue to analyze her performances. Fashion scholars will reference her style. Activists will cite the foundation she built. But none of those alone explain why her story still holds attention decades later. The answer may lie in what she refused to do. She refused to perform nostalgia. She refused to apologize for change. She refused to remain accessible once her priorities shifted. And in doing so, she left behind something increasingly uncommon, a life that unfolded on its own terms. As news of her passing spread, the foundation emphasized continuity rather than closure. Its message wasn't about endings, but about continuation, of work, of values, of responsibility. That's not accidental. It reflects how Brigitte Bardot herself approached legacy, not as something to be admired, but as something to be maintained. And that perspective forces us to rethink what it means to leave something behind. Because maybe legacy isn't about how loudly someone is remembered, but how long their work continues without them. And that idea becomes even more relevant when we look at what happens next. When a public figure passes away, the instinct is often to summarize their life in a single sentence. For Brigitte Bardot, that instinct doesn't work, because no single label, actress, icon, activist, fully explains what she represented or why her story continues to resonate long after her last film. What makes her legacy distinctive is not just what she did, but when she chose to stop. At a moment when global recognition was secure, she stepped away from the role the world most wanted her to keep playing. Not out of scandal, not out of disappearance, but out of decision. And that decision reshaped everything that followed. Her later years were quieter, more private, and often misunderstood, yet they were consistent, focused, and purpose-driven. The foundation she built did not depend on her presence to function, which is maybe the clearest indication of long-term impact. According to its own statements, its work will continue without interruption, guided by the same mission Bardot established decades ago. That continuity is not symbolic, it is practical. And that's maybe the most revealing part of her story, because it suggests that the life she chose after fame wasn't a retreat, it was a redirection. A shift from being seen to building something that didn't need attention to survive. As audiences reflect on her passing, there's an opportunity to reconsider how we define success, influence,